Welcome. Today we'll be exploring how cells manage what comes in and out of a cell using membrane transport, how they use energy, and how they keep everything running smoothly. From selective permeability to ATP, let's dive into the microscopic world of a cell transportation. This presentation is presented to you by me, Jaime, and it was made by Emily and Sydney. Today we'll be covering topics such as selective permeability, concentration gradient, passive transport, active transport, endocytosis, exocytosis, facilitated diffusion, ATP, and finally, membrane proteins. In order to dive into the topic of selective permeability, we need to know what a cell membrane is, because that's what facilitates the movement. A cell membrane is basically the fence of a cell. It is the fence of the cell. It keeps things on the inside regulated and allows it to stay in place, and it keeps it at peace. It doesn't allow things to disturb it from the outside, or it doesn't allow other foreign attackers to come inside and ruin this homeostasis of the cell. This layer is found in both plant and animal cells, unlike the plant wall, and it's basically the security guard. The cell membrane is made up of components of glycolipids, carbohydrates, proteins, glycoproteins, cholesterol, phospholipid, and transport proteins. In this diagram right here, we have the transport protein, which is the channel that allows proteins to come in and out of the cell. And then we have these little heads and tails, which serve as the cell membrane. Those are what keeps the structure of the cell membrane, and the little heads right here are phospholipids, and the tails are made up of cholesterol. Breaking that more down, we have proteins. Proteins are a key component to every single living thing, and sometimes non-living things. They make up everything. They allow for transport signaling and cell-to-cell adhesion. Then we have phospholipids. Phospholipids are what keep the cell membrane structure and keep it upright without folding or anything. And it's made up of a layer, it makes up the bilayer, and it has a phospholipid head, which is hydrophobic, which means it's hydrophilic, which means it likes water. And then it has hydrophobic tails because they're made out of lipids, specifically cholesterol. Then we have glycolipids. Glycolipids are made of lipids, as it says in the name, and a type of carbohydrate called oligosaccharides. Excuse me if I pronounce any of it wrong. And these two are bonded together by a glycosidic bond or covalent bond. The glycolipids' role is to be a marker for cell recognition on the top of the cell membrane. Then we have glycoproteins. Obviously, it's unlike the glycolipid, it's made up of proteins and then another carbohydrate. And this carbohydrate is called an oligosaccharide. This basically, the glycoprotein is like a control center for both plant and animal cells to control growth and reproduction of the cells. And it's typically found in the nucleus, and it holds all the chromosomes, which is basically like DNA. Then we have the transport protein. Transport proteins are a big factor of the integral membrane proteins. They are the proteins that allow for movement across the membranes, and they allow for molecules to pass through passively. It's basically the big channel right here. And then we have cholesterol. As I mentioned earlier, cholesterol makes up the tail in the bilayer, and it just helps maintain the bilayer from crumbling or crushing, and it regulates flexibility, and it allows for higher efficiency in movement throughout the cell and in the cell. Then we have the big thing that we wanted to talk about, which is selective permeability. This refers to the cell's membrane ability to allow certain substances to pass through while keeping others out. Basically, it's like a bouncer at a club or a party where it only lets the right people, in this case molecules, to get in, and it keeps the other things that they don't want or other people out. And this selectivity is key for maintaining the cell's internal environment balanced. Another word for that, or a better term for that, is homeostasis, and that basically allows the cell to function properly. Then we have the concentration gradient. It's very similar to selective permeability, but the difference is the concentration of molecules across the space, and usually the cell membrane in this case. Molecules usually move from an area where it's more concentrated to an area where there's less concentration because it requires less energy or no energy. This movement actually doesn't require energy, and it's called passive transport. An example of this is oxygen in the lungs, and it's an example because oxygen in the lungs move into the blood because of this gradient, and it doesn't require energy, it just does it naturally. Then we have types of transport. There's two types of transport, passive transport and active transport. Passive transport is the movement of molecules across a membrane without using any energy. It happens when the molecules move from a high concentration to a low concentration gradient, and there are two types of passive transport, one of them being simple diffusion and the other being facilitated diffusion. In simple diffusion, small molecules pass right through the membrane, but in facilitated diffusion, larger or polar molecules use protein channels to cross. Then we have active transport. Unlike passive transport, active transport does require energy, and in this case it requires ATP, actually in all cases, or most cases. And it moves substances against the concentration gradient from low to high. A good example of this is the sodium-potassium pump, which pushes sodium out and pulls potassium into the cell. This keeps the cell's electrical balance and nutrient levels in check. Then we have endocytosis. You may be asking what that is. Endocytosis is a type of active transport where the cell takes in a large amount of molecules and it engulfs it with its membrane. It's specifically one large molecule being engulfed, and this membrane folds around the substance or large molecule, and it forms a vesicle to bring it inside the cell. A good example of this is white blood cells, and this is because they use this method to engulf and destroy bacteria, like when you're sick or to cure a wound. They rush to the site that needs to be protected and engulf it. Then we have exocytosis, which is on the flip side. Exocytosis is when the cell pushes a molecule out. Vesicles inside the cell fuse with the cell membrane and release their contents. For example, nerve cells use exocytosis to release neurotransmitters and send signals to other cells. Next, we have facilitated diffusion. As I mentioned earlier, facilitated diffusion helps molecules that are too big or polar to cross on their own. These molecules move through protein channels or carriers in the membrane, and no energy is required. Glucose is a good example. It enters the cell using a transport protein. Then we have ATP. ATP is the big energy that I was talking about. And it stands for adenosine triphosphate. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing it wrong again. It's basically what allows any energy in the cell, or it provides energy for the cell. ATP is the main energy currency of the cell, and when one of its phosphate bonds is broken, it releases energy, which turns into a new thing called ADP, and a free phosphate. And this energy powers things like muscle contraction, and of course, like I mentioned earlier, and we talked about for membrane transportation, active transport. That's what it does. Then, lastly, we have membrane proteins. Taking a deeper look on membrane proteins, These are proteins that are embedded in or attached to the cell membrane, and they play many roles, like transporting molecules, receiving signals, and identifying other cells. Some of these proteins form channels, like aquaporins, which allow water to move through the membrane easily. And yeah, that's all you need to know for membrane transport. And yeah, from regulating traffic through the membrane to using ATP for energy, cells are constantly working to stay alive and balanced. Thank you so much for learning with us today. And remember, just like your body, your cells have systems and strategies to keep everything running right. That's all. Thank you for listening.